if you had to list out the most important Indian cars, top of the list would obviously be the Maruti 800. After that, you'd have what? The Zen, the Ambassador, the Padmini, the Santro. But I would submit the second most important Indian car has to be this, the Tata Indica. It showed that India was capable of locally designing, engineering and manufacturing a car. We did not need imports. It put Indian engineering on the map and laid the foundation for the skyrocketing Indian automotive industry. The Tata Indica, it sold for 20 years in lots of different versions. Today, we have some of the most important versions of the Indica. And this was a car that was born out of Ratan Tata's vision to have a car with the space of an Ambassador, the footprint of a Zen, the purchase cost of a Maruti 800 and the running cost of a diesel. Welcome to Gone But Not Forgotten and welcome to our tribute to the Tata Indica. And of course, before we go ahead, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with like-minded enthusiasts. Do you have an Indica memory? Let us know in the comments below. And of course, don't forget to stay subscribed to the Evo India channel. This episode of Gone But Not Forgotten is going to dive into the complete history of the Indica, and that's why I've pulled out all my reference books, all the old Overdrive magazines which we've been referring to for all these Gone But Not Forgotten episodes to bring you all the little details and refresh my memory of what is a very important car. Now, Ratan Tata's vision for the small car which he expressed in 1995 was no small feat for his engineers. Not least because of the fact that his engineers had never really made a car. The Sierra and the Safari before this were proper ladder frame SUVs, but this was a monocoque, and that's why Telco, as Tata Motors was then called, they roped in the Idea Institute in Turin to design the car. They didn't design just one car, not just the Indica, but they designed an entire family of cars. Later on in this episode, we will talk about the Indigo and the Marina, even the stillborn Indiva. But first, I want to show you pictures of the Aria. Now, before the Aria became an Innova rival, the Aria was a cute little small sports car. This was shown at the Auto Expo in 2000 and it showcased the versatility of the platform, what all could be spawned of Project Mint, as the Indica project was then called. So the Aria, it was first shown as this convertible Ferrari red in color. The engine was an outsourced engine. It was a 4-cylinder petrol engine, made some 140 bhp, was supposed to get the car up to 225 kilometers per hour, which for those days was very quick. That car we all drooled over. And then a couple of months later, at the Geneva Motor Show in 2001, Tata Motors, they showcased the coupe version of the Aria. In silver, obviously it was not as eye-catching, but it was a very good piece of automotive styling and it obviously got us all drooling. Of course, none of these saw the light of day because Telco were focused on bringing the Indica to market and sorting out all the problems that they had. The Indica took off to a rocking start. Within a week, it clocked 1,15,000 bookings. Maruti was so spooked that they dropped prices of the bread and butter 800 by 30,000 bucks. Everybody wanted an Indica until the shit hit the ceiling fan. Tata Motors, they were steeped in their truck culture. They still didn't know how to deal with proper passenger vehicle consumers. They did not have a quality mindset, and quality problems besieged those early lot of Indicas. From wheel alignment issues to belt snapping to belt squeaking to AC not working to frequent breakdowns, problems were many. Tata Motors were really in a soup. In 2000-2001, they posted a 500 crore loss, the highest ever in the history of the company. Observers attributed that massive loss to the failure of Ratan Tata's dream project, the Indica. In fact, they were so disillusioned with this whole car-making project that they wanted to sell it off. They went to Ford, and it is alleged that Ford really humiliated them, told those guys that if you don't know how to make a car, why did you even get into the car-making business? Well, turns out, a decade later, Tata went back to Ford and purchased Jaguar and Land Rover, took those two jewels off their hands. So Tata Motors, they scripted a turnaround story, and that was on the back of this, the Indica V2.
The V2 doesn't look very different from the early Indicas, but those early Indicas are hard to find, and that's why we don't even have it here in this test. The V2 sorted out all those quality issues. There were still a few here and there, but the major issues were all sorted out, and it scripted a turnaround story in the Indica books. It really took off, and from then on, there was no looking back.
The very first Indica that I drove was the Indica 2000. Now that was in June of 2000. I was just 2 months into my internship at Overdrive, and this is one of the first cars that I actually drove. Yogendra, he did the road test. We got the specifications also of it. Now the diesel, that did around 58 bhp and did 0 to 100 in 24 odd seconds. The petrol, because of the fuel injection, power went up from 60 bhp on the carbureted car to 75 bhp, and the 0 to 100 time, we have it out here, as tested, was 14.4 seconds. These cars were all tested at the VRD. We used to go to the VRD and test every single car for the road test. And since we have all the specifications up here, we might as well tell you the price also. 3.62 lakhs, all inclusive on the road. That was the base version, and with power windows, power steering, AC but no stereo, the price went up to 4.56 lakhs. So that's what cars cost back in 2000.
The Indica is what, a 25-year-old car now, but look at the styling. It still looks good today. It's got this Tata smiling grille, which was a design feature of all Tata cars for a very long time. The styling was done by Aria in Turin in Italy, and overall the proportions were great. The styling was really good, except for one big problem, and that was the gap in the wheel arches. They used to call this the 1 bhk gap in the wheel arches. This is massive. These are running the 13-inch wheels. Obviously, it didn't come with these alloy wheels when it was new. It came with steel wheels with wheel caps. But just look at the gap. It was inexplicable why it had to have such gaping gaps in the wheel arches. And over at the rear, you have this vertical tail lamps. So the styling was attractive. Also, in those initial days, they were sold with the black bumpers, which looked quite hideous, but the V2 came with body-colored bumpers, looked really cool, gets a small little spoiler at the back, and this is something I want to show you, no central locking. The space. Now, the Altroz talks about 90-degree opening doors, but the Indica is also almost 90 degrees. Easy to get in, so old people didn't have problems with creaking knees. And then look at the space at the back. Remember, this was competing with the Zen, and the Zen was properly cramped at the back. But here, proper full-size adults could fit in. I have enough knee room, my toes are tucked under the front seat. They say that this was designed so that Ratan Tata could be comfortable in the back of an Indica, and a properly grown human being can actually sit comfortably. There's also enough headroom, and this was a sea change from the small cars that we had at that time. The Zen, the Santro, the Martis, all were small, tiny little cars. This was properly roomy. He wanted the space of an Ambassador, and Ratan Tata delivered almost the space of an Ambassador within the footprint of a Zen. That again was a huge selling point for the Indica. This could be the only car in the family where everybody in the family could travel comfortably.
I spent tons of time in Indicas. The Indica V2, this diesel was my very first long-termer at Overdrive, and over 9 months I did over 25,000 kilometers. It didn't have much in the way of power, but it was fuel efficient, and that's why even on a correspondence salary, I could afford to drive it all over the country. This picture, that was shot when I took it on holiday to the Rann of Kutch. From there, with our entire family, we went to Rajasthan, and on the way back, in the night, the accelerator cable snapped. So we had to figure out a solution where for 25 kilometers, I was basically pulling that accelerator cable with my hand until we could get to a truck stop where we jugado-fied an accelerator cable, and then we drove it back to Pune. And before we went on this road trip, the exhaust manifold, the flange had cracked, the power window switches failed. But after those initial problems were done, after that, the Indica V2, it remained thoroughly reliable. Not much in the way of power, but then the next Indica that I drove was a proper rally-spec Indica.
J. Anand and his eponymous JA Motorsport outfit, they had a big hand in Tata Motors' early cars, the Indica especially. JA Motorsport, they developed a rally version of the Indica, called it the Indica Rally, obviously, And that was the first proper rally car that I actually drove. So that was built as a safety car for the Indian National Rally Championship that was going to be used as the test bed for a proper full-fledged INRC campaign. I drove that safety car at the Rally of Maharashtra in Nasik, at the Pune Rally also over here. But by then those cars had become really old and the car broke down, the dampers came through the struts. But what I want to focus on is that that car showed the potential of a performance Indica. It had the petrol engine, but the power was boosted up, it had a proper exhaust, a proper full rally build. It handled really well compared to the S-Teams that were running back in the day. The Indica really handled well and it had a lot of potential to become a proper motorsport car.
Hot Indicas were planned right at the start of the project. When we first went to see the Tata Indigo, which was then called the Indica Sedan before the name was actually finalized, we saw prototypes of a blazing yellow Indica Sport. This was also shown at the 2002 Auto Expo. A nice little body kit, 15-inch wheels, another steering wheel. So it did look sporty, but that was more a styling exercise because we were not sure what sort of power the engine put out and all of that. But that blazing yellow color soon made its way onto the Indica Rally prototypes. So that was the Indica Rally. JA Motorsport, they also made the Indica Race. That was based on the Indica Xeta, and that was sort of visioned as a one-make racing series, sort of much before the Polo Cup even came down to India. Obviously, that also didn't happen. But the wildest of them all was the Indica Silhouette Racer. That was shown at the 2006 Auto Expo. So in those days, JA Motorsport also used to make components for race cars abroad, and they used to do a lot of work for the Solution F tin top racing series that had a same basic space frame and a 3.5 litre V6 Renault engine, but different manufacturers could put different bodywork on it. And JA Motorsport, they fashioned the Indica bodywork onto that mid-engine race car. That race car, it made some 330 bhp, and it was rumored that the lap time was even quicker than a Porsche 911 GT3. So as a statement of intent, that was epic. That was the fastest Tata ever made. But of course, never really went racing, never really made it into production. JA Motorsport also did a lot of work with Go Faster Indica prototypes. They even shoehorned the 1.6 litre Rover K series engine. It made over 100 bhp. They shoehorned that into the Indica. I drove one of those prototypes and it was fast. It not only had more power, but it had upgraded brakes, upgraded suspension, upgraded tires, and it was solid fun to drive. In fact, we have a picture here from JA Motorsport's archives of Jay Anand throwing it completely sideways while fine-tuning its dynamics at the racetrack. That was a hoot to drive, and if that had gone into production, that would have been India's first hot hatch. But obviously, it never saw the light of day. And now, let's get behind the wheel of the Indica and see what it is like after all these years.
And first things first, the petrol engine is definitely far more sprightly and energetic than the diesel engine. This petrol engine, it makes 75 bhp. The diesel made 53 bhp. Remember those first diesel engines, they were non-turbocharged. The turbocharged diesel, that came around 2004, and the higher spec versions got an intercooler. The base spec versions did not even get an intercooler for those turbo engines. But at the start, even for the V2 journey, the diesel engine was non-turbocharged. So big difference in the power, even the torque. Because it was non-turbocharged, that diesel made less torque than the petrol. That diesel engine really had to cane it to get any sort of performance out of it. And because you really caned that engine, that's why a lot of those reliability issues also came about, because you were really stressing that engine. Now, the interesting thing about the engines, at the launch itself, they had both the petrol and diesel. Both were 1.4 liters and both had the same block. In fact, those engines were derived from Tata Motors' existing portfolio. Engines that were used in commercial applications but downsized for an application like the Indica. And that's why they could optimize costs and bring it at that price point.
Another way to cut costs was in the manufacturing facility. So Tata Motors, they picked up a mothballed Nissan factory in Australia, dismantled it brick by brick and reassembled it in Pimpri in Pune. That was the new K block and that was the new Indica plant. It was said that the rumored cost of around $2 billion for a new plant that reduced by almost 1/4, and that's where obviously they got a terrific amount of cost savings. Also, the powertrains, both the 1.4 diesel and the 1.4 petrol, shared the same block, and that engine was actually repurposed from the existing commercial vehicles that Tata Motors were using, which in fact was repurposed from an old Peugeot engine, and that's how they got other cost efficiencies in place. But they made their own gearbox. Tata Motors didn't really have any expertise in making passenger car gearboxes, and it showed.
Refinement is not a strong point. The gear shift is clearly not a strong point. Of course, the gearbox mount is going, and that's why the gear lever is moving around a fair bit. But the Indicas, in fact, all early Tata Motors cars, the Safari, the Sumo, all their gearboxes had a lot of play. They were very imprecise. Tata Motors made their own gearboxes, but they never made nice gearboxes. The Zen gearbox was slicing through butter with a hot knife. The Indica gearbox was just, fishing for a gear in a pile of mud. Poor gearboxes. Even today when you drive it, the gearbox is all over the place. Now to drive, it feels like a 20-year-old car. There's a lot of play, a lot of movement, a lot of shuddering. This is a bit all over the place. That's not a bit, it is fairly all over the place. The steering, it's okay, but it's not very precise. There is a bit of play. This is not a enthusiast car, not by a long shot. The petrol, that got the white-faced dials. That was the cool part about the petrol engine. But at the start, or maybe in this spec, it did not get a tachometer. Probably the higher spec versions got a tachometer. I can't say for sure. But this is the base spec. So there are no power windows. You get normal manual wind windows. It's been an age since we did this. No power windows. The power window switches used to be out here. And I remember in my long-term Indica, the first thing that happened, the first quality issue that happened was the power window switches breaking. This Indica is actually in pristine shape. It's got the same silver finished panel for the aircon, no stereo, white face clocks, same seats. I remember these seats, very comfortable seats. Also ride comfort, very good. Tata Motors always did those ergonomics well. So in terms of the driving position, the visibility out, except for the position of the steering wheel, which was too high up. But apart from that, this was a very nice car to drive in terms of comfort.
The Indica was never meant to be a standalone product. Now, before platform sharing became a buzzword, variations on the Indica platform were already baked into the project. The first of those was the Indigo Sedan. Now, this wasn't just a boot stuck onto the back of the Indica. Here, the wheelbase was stretched out by 50 mm. It increased the back space. They also completely revised the rear suspension. They tightened up the handling. In fact, this picture, this is from the road test of the Indigo back in January of 2003. And you can see me hustling it really hard at the Tata skid pad. And there is one thing that really I remember from those briefings that we got, and Tata Motors used to give us really long, lengthy briefings, and that was the fact that the Indigo ran on 14-inch wheels. Back then, it was only the Lancer SFX and the City VTEC that got 14-inch wheels, and Tata Motors' engineers and product planners made sure that we noticed and we wrote about the fact that the Indigo had 14-inch wheels. And you can see those 14-inch wheels, the tires fully buckling, that wheel cap almost scraping against the tarmac. And those days also I used to full send. Another thing that did not miss our attention was the Indiva prototype. That did not see the light of day. Va obviously for van, so that was the Indica van, and it was a futuristic looking van, a 5-seater van, but pretty ahead of its times. but obviously the tooling cost for that would have been really expensive, and that's why that never went into production. But another people mover, another more practical version of the Indica went into production, and that was the Indigo Marina station wagon.
What I want to show you here is the Indigo Marina, the station wagon built off the Indica platform. Those days, even today for that matter, Indians just did not buy estates, but manufacturers hadn't yet cottoned on to the fact, and they were still making estates, tapping into that non-existent market. And just look at the end result. Look at the proportions of the Marina. Isn't this really good looking? Everything looks proportionate from the boot all the way to the end. The Indigo looked like the boot was stuck on to the end of the Indica, but this flows. They moved the wheels up to 14 inches from 13. So look at the wheel arch gaps. That was sorted out. They added 50 millimeters to the wheelbase, so you had more space at the back. The doors were different. In fact, this entire section was shared with the Indigo, so they optimized costs. The rear doors were also shared with the Indigo. And the boot space, well, it had a massive boot. Plenty of space, and this wasn't part of standard equipment, but people fashioned a cushion out here and you stuck 2 kids over there. Those were carefree days. Who knew about safety in those days? And that made this an unofficial 7-seater. But I really want to point out the styling of the Marina. Just look at how good it looks. Of all the Indica, Indigo generations, to me, to my eye, this is the nicest looking, the best designed. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.
The Marina was the luxury car of that time. It had power steering, it had power windows, even at the back it had powered windows. It's right there at the bottom of the doors. It had a functional roof rail in terms of styling. The B-pillar had the black cladding, so it actually gelled really well. This car I'm particularly familiar with. My mom's upstairs neighbor, Colonel Billy Mehta, he owned this car. He owned this car from new, then his son ran it, and they only sold it in December of last year. And it basically moved 500 meters to the other side of the road. So these parts where I'm driving, this is where the car has been used for the past 20 years. In 20 years, it has done precisely 42,606 kilometers. That is it. So this car is practically like new, and because Parsi owned, well, this car is absolutely in pristine condition. The only real problem is the brakes have gone all the way to the floor, so there is no way that we can drive it outside the city. 1.5 hours without any brakes is going to be just too stressful, especially for a car that has been maintained so well. It even has that service sticker. That's the place that I used to service my own Zen at. That is still operational. There's not even one scratch. The rear tail lamp has a small hole in it, and I'm sure the only reason why it is still there is because there are no spares available. These tail lamps were unique to the Marina. It was not shared with the Indica. So because of that, that's why that small hole is there. But otherwise, the bodywork is unblemished. This is probably the finest example of a Marina you will find anywhere.
To power the Indigo and the Marina, which were obviously a little heavier than the Indica, the engines were suitably upgraded. So the Petrol, it got 10 bhp more, got up to 85 bhp, and that spec of engine went into this car, the City Rover. So now the Indica exports has started almost from day one, and even today you can see Indicas, the very first generation Indicas in some countries. When I went to South Africa recently, I saw Indicas still plying on the roads. But the world stood up and took notice when this car came, when the City Rover went to the UK and was sold by MG Rover. So compared to the cars we had in India, the differences were only minor. It had this MG corporate grille, new bumpers, 14-inch rims, that 85 bhp engine, and tightened suspension. Otherwise, it was the same, except for one thing, the pricing. it was frightfully expensive. So word on the street was that MG Rover were paying Tata Motors £3,000 per Indica, and in return they were selling the City Rover to their customers at £6,500. So no surprise, sales were well short of the target, and that's where Tom Walkinshaw Racing, TWR, that comes into the picture. So they were working with MG Rover on the next range of cars, the upgrade on the Rover 45 and the Rover 75, and as a stopgap they proposed an upgrade on the City Rover. So using his own styling resources, and those days TWR, their styling department was headed by Peter Stevens, they completely restyled the Indica. They shoehorned the 1.6 litre Rover K series engine, made over 100 bhp. They shoehorned that engine into the City Rover. They stiffened up the suspension and sorted out a lot of things. And these are the very first images to be publicly revealed of that City Rover prototype. These images have not been seen earlier before. This is the first time that we are showing it. And doesn't it look really cool? Take another close look at those images. Now just imagine if the Indica looked like that, with those proportions, that stance. How epic would that have been? Except that never obviously came to fruition. In 2005, MG Rover, they went bankrupt, and that was that for the City Rover project. Meanwhile, upgrades to the Indica in the domestic market happened thick and fast. The diesel engine was upgraded with the KKK turbocharger, power went up to 63 bhp, and then when BS3 emission norms came in, power went up further to 70 bhp. And it needed every single one of those horses because Tata Motors, they added 200 mm to the wheelbase of the Indigo to create the Indigo XL. This was the long wheelbase Indigo, and they made it a point to make sure that we noticed that it had as much space as an S-Class at the back. Also, to go with the luxury positioning, the interiors were fully in beige. It got the option of leather upholstery. It also got screens in the rear headsets connected to the VCD player. Remember VCD players those days? And it got a half wood steering wheel. I only ever drove that Indigo XL at the Tata Motors test track, and it wasn't great to drive. It was a bit wobbly. But look at this. Here it's me hustling the Indigo XL round the skid pad, and the inside rear wheel has actually got a fair bit of air, and you can see the amount of body roll. Man, we were brave to be driving cars like that. The Indigo XL also got a petrol engine, which was the upgraded 1.4, which actually put out 100 bhp. And in those days, a 100 bhp car was like a sports car in India. 100 bhp was epic. This got that twin cam 16 valve badges also on the rear, showcasing that this was the go faster Indigo XL. But honestly, nobody really wanted an Indigo XL. What people wanted was a smaller, cheaper Indigo, and that was the Indigo CS.
Tata Motors' engineers and product planners, they were the first to cotton on to this idea. Now that the Indian government is giving these excess duty regulations to sub 4 meter cars, the Indica was obviously sub 4 meter. But why don't we squeeze the Indigo under sub 4 meters, take advantage of those excess duty regulations, and of course price it even more aggressively? And that was the Indigo CS. When it was launched, the Indigo CS was the world's smallest sedan, and this gave rise to that whole genre of compact sedans. The Desire, the Amaze, all those compact sedans have their roots in this, with what Tata Motors did with the Indigo, chopping off the boot and creating a compact sedan. Obviously, not the most beautiful car in the world. Those initial cars were all cut-paste jobs. But this car, actually, because of its pricing, went on to be pretty successful. You don't see any of those estates anymore, but these you will still see.
I don't know why the Indigo or Indica started to get those beepers. It just makes no sense. I've got my seatbelt on also, and it's not linked to the seatbelt. And that beeper was there on all the Indicas, Indigos, all the Tata cars also. That irritating for no reason. So anyway, this is the Indigo CS. After the Indigo CS came the Indigo ECS, which was basically a facelift. This is based on the Indigo platform, which is the extended wheelbase. compared to the Indica. So there is more space at the back, and that's why this was popular in the taxi market, because of the additional space at the back, and of course the cost, because the cost of this, it was the cheapest sedan that you could buy. So cost was always a huge reason for people to buy either the Indica or the Indigo, or especially the Indigo ECS. And plus, even though the boot was so small, people then retrofitted gaskets into this. This one also has a gasket, and in the boot there is absolutely no space, zero. It's completely full. Now to drive, it's really no different from either the Indica or the Indigo. With these old cars, you can't really push it that hard to make out the differences in terms of handling, and the differences that the increased wheelbase makes in terms of handling. But that increased wheelbase made the Indigo a little bit more stable than the Indica. The gearbox, look at the amount of play. Full solid play you got with the gearbox, 5-speed manual gearbox, no automatic. Those were before the era of automatics. The steering wheel, actually a rather hideous looking steering wheel. The original Indica steering wheel, the 4-spoke design, that was inspired by the W124 Mercs, and that is a nice looking steering wheel. This, the T, and then the Tata T in the middle of it, chrome, uske beech mein, I don't know what all is going on over here. So this steering wheel was unique to the Indigos. The Indicas continued with that 4-spoke steering wheel. This apparently was done to make it seem and look a little bit more premium, but otherwise the dash remained the same. You got this fake wood kind of insert for the aircon controls, different colors for the plastic, but hard, cheap plastics. It's quite poor in terms of the quality. The tiles were different, and this tile actually looked good. It's white-faced, silver rings around it. So nice looking tiles, but the architecture remains bang identical. Seats remain bang identical. The driving position remains identical. Everything is the same. This car has been used a little bit more extensively than the other cars, so you can feel the wheels wobbling. You hit a pothole hard and the wheel alignment is going to go for a toss. This is what all those Indica cabs that used to come and pick us up in the past used to feel like, all over the place. In fact, some of those Indica cabs that picked us up, oh god, they would always be dirty on the inside. They would be abused to within an inch of their lives. That really ruined the reputation of the Indica nameplate, because those cars, they were used until they were dead, like absolutely dead. They couldn't even be used at all. They really abused those Indicas. I feel sorry for those cars, but those lived such a hard life. The steering used to wobble, the wheels used to wobble. Sitting at the back, you were always on the brink of a really nasty accident. It was terrible, really terrible. It's a good thing all those Indy cabs are off the road. And it's not a reflection of the car itself, because those cars were not taken care of. They were not sent to the service center. Some roadside mechanic with a hammer would really work on it. And they were horrible. You would hear those cars coming into your society because of that fan belt, because that fan belt noise. That used to be the noise of India starting up at one point of time. There were so many Indicas all over the place, and every time a diesel Indica started up, that fan belt would go, you would hear it everywhere, all over the country at one point in time. Oof. What times and what things to remember the Indica by. Sadly, but that's true.
Remember our criticism on the styling of the Indica, those gaping wheel arch gaps? That was addressed on the Xeta facelift. So the big thing was this cladding around the wheel arches, and that sort of reduced the gap in the arches. But it also had the effect that it made these 13-inch wheels look like small casters on shopping trolleys. These wheels look really small, though they're actually the same size as on the original Indica. The Xeta also got these clear headlamps, small styling updates, but under the hood, the engine, it was downsized to 1.2 liters. So this came at the same time as the small car excess duty regulations, the sub 4 meter regulations. One part of it was obviously the length, under 4 meters. The second part was that the petrol engine had to be under 1.2 liters. The petrol engine on the Indica was 1.4 liters, so they downsized the engine, made it under 1.2 liters. Horsepower went down, torque actually went up, and that is the Xeta for you.
The Xeta also had the earlier facelift, so you had more chrome around the smiley grille, the clear lenses in the headlamps, and those wheel arch extensions. The big mechanical difference, apart from the engine of course, was that this was made softer. That was obviously done to improve the ride quality, though the ride quality of the Indicas were always good. By softening the suspension, they gave it a little bit more body roll, even vaguer handling. Actually, to drive, the Indica V2 feels a little better than the Xeta. Obviously because of soft suspension, so now it's roly-poly all over the place, moves around much more. The low-speed ride has got better, but once you get up to 60, 80, all these undulations, they make the car move around a fair bit. In terms of the engine, the power went down by 10 bhp, the torque went down by 10 bhp, but it also became a little smoother thanks to different ECU tuning and obviously all the lessons that they've been learned over the past couple of years with that earlier 1.4 engine. Torque was never really a problem with this engine. Out and out performance was, but torque was never an issue. It was always strong, especially in the lower and mid-range. And apart from that, to drive, the Indica Xeta remained more or less the same as the Indica V2. On the inside, you got different color for the plastics. The design of the dashboard remained bang identical. I think the clock was now standard. Earlier, it was an option. You got this silver finish for the aircon surround and this glossy black for the center. There was a new ashtray which slid out and it slides out even when you don't want it to. But that was the quality of these parts that Tata Motors threw at it. This particular example still has the manual windows. The power window switches were out here ahead of the gear lever. And talking about the gear lever, the shift quality, again, nowhere near best in class. This actually was the worst gear shift around. Now Indicas, they have to be taken care of because they were never built like Maruti's. Maruti's were very reliable, quality also was excellent. But Indicas, if you did not take care of it, they would start to squeak and rattle. Come on. And make all sorts of noises that would irritate you. And now you don't get trim parts and all of that. So taking care of an Indica is not an easy task. But there are a few enthusiasts who are still taking care of their cars, and that's because they have a personal story with it. Like see this thing. Any small bump and that actually. And with this, wow, it's like way too much body roll. Way too much, way too soft. In fact, Govin's family bought this Indica Xeta from new. It was the first car that they bought, so that's why they have that emotional connect with it. They took it to Hyderabad, changed it to an AP registration, brought it to Maharashtra, changed it to an MH registration. But it's the same car that's been in the family all through and through. So he was telling me that all the rattles that I'm listening to right now, while going back, there is a rough patch of road and he's going to go fast over it. And he says that going fast over those rough patches will sort out those rattles and it'll be gone. Well, that's an Indica owner for you. But for all that you hear about the Indica's reliability and quality, Govin, Saurabh, all the owners, Siddharth, they tell me that the Indica has never broken down on them. It has never left them stranded anywhere. And that goes back to my own personal experiences with the Indicas. Sure, small bits of trim would come off, stuff like this would keep popping open, but it would never leave you stranded. Unless you really abused the car, did not service it on time, did not take care of it. But if you took care of it, it would never leave you stranded.
The Indica was now 10 years old and it was in desperate need of a full new change, including a new engine which Tata Motors did not have. Meanwhile, their rival Fiat were also struggling in India. They had a shrinking dealer network and there was no way for the cars to get to the customers because they didn't have enough dealers. And that's why, right at the top, by Fiat boss Sergio Marchionne and Ratan Tata, who were fast friends, they devised a unique partnership. A 50-50 JV was struck between Tata and Fiat. As part of the JV, Tata Motors pumped in 550 crores and Fiat chipped in with their manufacturing facility in Ranjangaon. Also part of the agreement was that Tata Motors would get access to the world's best small diesel engine, the Fiat 1.3 multi-jet diesel, which was being made at Ranjangaon. And Fiat in turn would have a steady buyer for their engines, and also they would get to make the replacement to the Indica, which came about as the Indica Vista. On the face of it, it was a win-win. Also included as part of the JV was a distribution agreement. So Fiat would sell their cars to Tata Motors, who would then distribute it through their own dealerships. So the Tata dealerships became Tata Fiat dealerships, and in the same dealership you would have an Indica and you would have a Palio. And that's how Fiat got access to 150 dealerships. So that was a sweet deal for everybody. And that's how the Tata Indica Vista Quadrajet was born.
In 2008 came the first generational update for the Indica. The Vista, it might look like the Indica and the profile and silhouette is similar to the Indica, but underneath this is all new. This had the X1 platform, which was heavily upgraded over the earlier Indica. The wheelbase went up by 70 millimeters and quality improved. Also, the powertrains, which was an earlier big problem with the Indicas, got sorted out, and that was thanks to the Tata-Fiat alliance.
The Vista was designed with European crash safety regulations in mind. So it had a higher percentage of hot formed steel planks. It was 25% stiffer than the earlier Indica. Even the front end, it was designed with European pedestrian impact regulations in mind. All this in 2008, before safety became anything of a talking point in India. That probably added weight and complexity to the Indica, which wasn't really needed in India. But you have to commend Tata Motors for thinking ahead of the times, thinking about safety when safety was not a talking point. That export ambition also dictated the design of the new dashboard. So the speedometer, it moved from behind the steering wheel to the center of the dash. The benefit of this obviously is that this same dash can be used in both LHD and RHD markets. You don't have to make two separate toolings. That does save a lot of cost. But I commented to the designers back then itself that this design I just don't like. Back then, they dismissed me like as if I did not know my ass from my elbow. But very soon after, when the Manza was launched, it moved back to behind the steering wheel where it should be. So I was not wrong then, I'm not wrong now. This I still don't like. You drive this car compared to the earlier Indicas, and this platform feels so much tighter, more together. It gives you a sense of solidity, the right quality. On the Indica, it was very good. On this, it is terrific. Even compared to the standards of today, the ride quality is terrific. And there is not much in the way of pitch and wallow. Body roll, of course, is there. And this other issue with the whole Indica, where the steering wheel is too high, that also they didn't manage to sort out. Even though seats are high, the steering wheel still feels too high. It does not adjust for reach. So those things weren't addressed, and that continued on till the end of its life. But another big improvement on the Vista were the powertrains. Both the diesel as well as the petrol engines were taken from Fiat. These engines were made at the Ranjangaon plant, which became a joint venture between Tata and Fiat. But obviously the designs of the engine were Fiat, IP was Fiat. What I'm driving is the diesel. Tata Motors called it Quadrajet, but this is the same 1.3 diesel engine, the multi-jet Fiat diesel engine, and it is a fantastic motor. Gone are those days where you have small diesels anymore. But there was a time when small diesels, you just had to have it if you had any hope of volumes. And this engine was terrific. It gave you damn good performance, damn good fuel efficiency. In fact, in the city, this car, even today, it gives around 18 kmpl, and on the highway, it does easily 22 to 24 kmpl. So the running costs are ridiculously good. The refinement, okay, it's not too loud. You can make out it's a diesel engine. There is no running away from that. But it's not like you have to scream and shout to make yourself heard over the GoPro. Refinement is sorted. In fact, these small diesel engines, they're lovely. I always was a fan of these small diesel engines and still am. It's a shame that the emission regulation has killed off this engine, because it was such a nice engine. Used everywhere. All the volume Marutis had this diesel engine. All the volume Tatas had this diesel engine. Whatever little Fiat made had this diesel engine. This was India's most popular engine. Driving this Vista after so many years, I still can't believe it feels actually very good. It has a nice long-legged feel. Okay, I'm not going on those corners at a million miles an hour, but at a relaxed, quickish pace, it can take this on very well. It drives really nicely. The problem that the Vista had was in 2008, the car that was making waves was the Nano. The Nano hogged the limelight. All the Tata Motors' attention was on the Nano. So Tata Motors never really communicated the Vista properly. People did not know that this was a new car. Even most journalists thought that this was just another facelift, with a new interior of course, but just another facelift.
The Vista spawned the Manza, whose wheelbase was stretched out to 2520 mm. The length was almost 4.5 meters, 1.7 meters wide. It was massive. The space inside was really terrific. And power was also not a worry, because the multi-jet engine was bumped up to 88 bhp, 90 PS, and that's where the Quadrajet 90 tag came in. And that same engine then went into the Vista D90, so the more powerful Vista. That engine also went into the D90 Extreme concept. So that was before the Nexon, where Tata Motors were trying to create a compact SUV before the Nexon was even made. And this was going to take on the Duster. It had the spare wheel on the tailgate. The ride height was raised by some 20-25 mm. So it was like that cross hatch. Thankfully, it did not come into production. That actually was replaced by the Bolt and the Zest later on. But there was that early confusion of both the Indica as well as the Palio being sold through the same dealerships. In private, Fiat officials grumbled that Tata Motors dealers weren't interested in selling Fiat cars. But we did some mystery shopping back in the day, and the dealers were happy to sell you whichever car they wanted. In fact, they had a better margin on Fiat cars, so they were happier selling Fiat cars. So that did not hold true. The fact was that both the Tata cars as well as the Fiat cars, they weren't great on quality. With Marutis, Toyota had come in with the Etios then, nothing ever went wrong. Whereas with the Tata car, you still had to make unscheduled pit stops at your service center, and that was its biggest problem. After-sales service and quality. And so it transpired that after 5 loss-making years, the distribution agreement was terminated. But the JV continues. So the Fiat plant in Ranjangaon, which makes the Jeeps, which makes the 2-liter diesel engines, which makes the Nexon, that still is a Tata Fiat 50-50 joint venture. So that part still continues, and that part is profitable.
For 20 years, the Indica was the bedrock of Tata Motors' passenger vehicle division until it became too much of a liability. All those Indicabs, which are basically run into the ground by their owners, those ruined the reputation of the Indica nameplate. And that's why the further evolution on the Vista, that was called the Bolt and the Zest. But they still carried on with the X1 platform from the Vista.
The Bolt and the Zest were the first 2 cars in the new Horizon Next strategy. Those were the first cars styled under the leadership of Pratap Bose. The smiley face, he called that the humanity line. Things were tightened up, and the Manza, that became the Zest, a sub 4-meter car. But there was still no question that these were facelifts of the earlier Vista and the Manza, and sales were a bit slow. Though, to push the fact that the quality had gone up, and the quality had genuinely gone up, they did a massive 50,000 kilometer speed endurance run. Adil Jal Darukhanawala, the contributing editor to Evo, he put that whole thing together, and all those 4 cars, they ran flawlessly. They set some 360 speed and endurance records driving non-stop, 50,000 kilometers non-stop. I think it took over a month at the VRD, the high-speed track at the VRD. Now, why mention the Tiago in a story on the Indica? The giveaway is 2,400 mm. That's the same wheelbase as the Tiago and the original Indica. The Tiago actually derives its roots from the very first Indica's platform, the X0 platform. So that is the lineage. Of course, heavily re-engineered and adapted for the times, but that initial expense, that back-breaking investment of 1,700 crore rupees that Tata Motors Telco back then put into Project Mint, it is still paying dividends. And the Nexon's X1 platform traces its roots back to the Vista. So India's best-selling SUV, the compact SUV frontrunner, the safest SUV in the compact SUV category, all that traces its roots back to the Indica Vista. And so the Indica's children and grandchildren, they continue to do really well. And then there is also the backstory of the electric cars. So before Tata Motors became this frontrunner of electric mobility, all those EV experiments were done with the Indica. I have here the October 2008 issue of Overdrive, and the very first line says, Tata Motors will soon introduce the Indica EV. Of course, nothing happened for years, but all that experimenting with electric cars, that started off with the Indica. So prototypes were shown in 2008. In 2011 came the Vista EV that had an upgraded motor, the TM4 Motive Series electric motor that could give a range of 200 kilometers 0 to 100 time in less than 10 seconds. Tata Motors' European Technical Center, they acquired a 50% stake in a Norwegian EV tech company. They actually established a pre-production facility at Coventry, and they made 25 electric prototypes which are given to the UK government for field trials. An aero-optimized Vista EVX that was also entered in the US Automotive X Prize and also won the most economical small passenger EV at the 2010 RAC Low Carbon Vehicle Challenge, the London to Brighton run. And all that set the groundwork for the Nexon EV.
And that tells you how important, how seminal the Indica was for India's car-making journey. Thank you for watching this special episode of Gone But Not Forgotten. If you have any memories of the Indica, let us know in the comments and tell us what we should feature next on this feature series. Thank you guys for watching, and don't forget to stay subscribed to the Evo India channel.